Psychopathology, which these days is understood increasingly in genetic terms and biochemical terms, offers yet another example of the powerful influence of context, not only on behavior and judgment, but on judgment within settings that are quite professional settings. And there's such great importance that attaches to this that it warrants separate attention within a lecture. Context and Psychopathology. And the subtitle that I give today's lecture is taken from a very famous paper on this subject published many years ago by Stanford University's Professor David Rosenhan, an article that he titled On Being Sane in Insane Places. And I'm going to talk about the research that Rosenhan did later in this lecture. Mental illness. Very interesting, isn't it? Recall Thomas Szasz' position that mental illness as a term refers to a kind of myth, the myth of mental illness. The only forms of illness that Szasz recognizes, the kinds of diseases he's prepared to recognize, are diseases that invade tissues and organs. And there isn't some organ called mind which can be diseased and suffer an illness. So what then do we mean by a mental illness? How do we define an illness that we regard in non-physical terms, but mental terms? And we begin to answer that question by raising another question, and that is, who has control of the labels? Who is it entrusted with the task of determining that Smith is manic or manic-depressive or melancholic, or that Jones is a witch? Because, after all, that was yet another form of disturbance which for 300 years received a therapeutic intervention that was absolutely lethal. Well, self-reference turns out to be one basis upon which we ascribe terms like mentally ill or neurotic or psychotic. This goes back to aspects of the attribution era, the fundamental attribution era, and indeed back to the ultimate attribution era. It goes something like this. We certainly know we're mentally healthy, don't we? I mean, we're all friends, we're engaged in common cause, we take in the same movies, we tend to live in the same sort of communities, we behave ourselves, tie and jacket, that sort of thing. Well, since we know we're all fine, we're all right, Jack, how about those outliers? How about those oddly dressed or funny-sounding or peculiarly behaving residents down the street? Well, for goodness sake, they're balmy. They're absolutely out of it. There's something missing in the attic. There's a screw loose. All these references are references not finally to an illness in any received medical sense or even psychological sense. Rather, they are references to differences between what we take to be the proper mode of conduct, perception, and decorum, and what some other individual or group is doing. Self-reference figures centrally in the definition of mental illness. In many settings, then, Smith is mentally disturbed to the extent that Smith significantly differs from me. Now, there's another source of definition for mental disease or mental illness, and that is the law. The law defines the range over which our behavior can function in the world. Those that fall beyond the ambit of what the law permits are referred to as being outlaws, but then when it comes to the level of explanation, we discover, or we think we discover, that in some forms of outlaw-type behavior, the actual cause is a mental disturbance. But were the law to take no position on the conduct at all, were there nothing within criminal or civil law to single out a certain bit of behavior as warranting our concern, then, of course, the issue of whether this is a criminal act or the product of mental illness would not arise. And so, to some extent, what the official legal language and perspective of a culture or society or an age takes to be permissible and normal helps the citizens in that age define what is to be regarded as evidence of mental illness or the criminally I will mention later in this lecture, for example, homosexuality. Now, homosexuality 25, 30 years ago in many jurisdictions was an offense punishable by law. In yet other contexts, it was a treatable form of mental illness. In most jurisdictions, it no longer has the character of a punishable unlawful act, and in the official Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, it's no longer listed as a treatable mental illness. Now, we want to ask the question, what's happened in the last 30 years that would cause those changes? Is it some medical or scientific discovery, or is it a kind of perspectival shift that really reflects the shifting standards, values, and judgments of the culture? So I get back to the question, who has control of the labels? And in the domain of psychopathology, in contrast to the domain of physiological pathologies, the culture at large seems to have possessory rights and dispository powers where these labels are involved, whether someone is going to be regarded as mentally ill or not. Nonetheless, whether culture has a heavy part to play in all this, there is also the assumption of expertise when it comes to assigning labels of this kind. And I want to say this in a way that is respectful of the accomplishments, the long experience, the motivations, the assiduous study that all figure in achieving standing as a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist. These are persons engaged in what in another age might be called God's work, no question about it, valiantly trying to help people achieve some accommodation to the pressures of the world, some success and happiness in life. That should be noted, and I hope it now is duly recorded, as I go on to say that the assumption of expertise in these areas, I think, is quite easily and effectively challenged. We certainly do not have in these areas the kind of expertise that we would find in any of the developed sciences. We do not have the kind of expertise that we find in any of the developed areas of medicine. This is one reason why in insanity defense trials, both sides can line up experts to plead entirely different cases, to make entirely different diagnoses, to challenge each other hip and thigh, all the experts on both sides having the PhDs and MDs that you expect, the published papers, the years of clinical experience, and it would take somebody entirely cynical, far more cynical than I am, to say, well, they're simply guns for hire, and they'll say whatever they're paid to say. These are people who would be earning substantial incomes without having to follow some party line. Rather, there are just such radically opposed perspectives on the very nature of mental illness that in an utterly non-cynical way, you can go out and have eminently credentialed persons able to and willing to plead either side of the instant case. And thus, I think it is warranted to say that what expertise refers to in the field of mental illness is an expert knowledge of existing texts and perspectives, rather than an expert knowledge of the mind itself. That continues to be a quite elusive entity, whatever it turns out to be. So that nonetheless, and we see this in other areas of compliance, obedience, social perception, and the like, the very credentials themselves will lead the unsuspecting to believe that there is indeed expertise. And in this regard, we will find throughout history this, what one scholar has referred to as village credulity. That is to say, when the bishop calls in the witch pricker, who has long experience finding that place on the surface of the witch's body, where the devil's mark has rendered that surface insensitive and anesthetic, and the crowd, the jury, and those in the court stand back and hear this expert testifying that it was only when he finally reached the most hidden reaches of this now shaved body that indeed he did turn up that anesthetic spot, and so there is proof positive of some complicity, some pactum implicitum with dark forces, and people now breathe a sigh of relief, thankful and happy that they are not going unjustly to have this witch executed, but rather the devil will be ridded from her by the very mode of execution itself, hanging, burning, and the like. Now, look, I don't want to put psychiatric diagnosis on a par with what witch prickers were doing. It's not, indeed. Nonetheless, there's something about the modes of interview, the psychiatric tests, the personality tests, the brain scans, the long clinical experience that meld and merge with social perceptions and practices and cultural values so that the outcome is not of the sort Jones has diabetes. The outcome is of a rather more complex sort, and these labels then are not so much the product of a scientific expertise as the product of a set of agreements within a given professional community, which the rest of us are prepared to accept as a community of experts. So much then on this matter of who has control of the labels. I'm not suggesting for a moment that some other group should have control of the labels. What I am suggesting is that the groups now in control of the labels enjoy a degree of authority, and their utterances are accepted at a level of validity that I don't think can be sustained by the actual facts of the matter. I don't mean this to be a controversial statement, and of course there's always much more to be said on a subject of this sort. But in this domain, work is very grass. Well, should we invoke a medical model? Should we bring back the medical model that was triumphant throughout the 19th century and into much of the 20th century, where, without much by way of evidence, the argument was that a bona fide mental disease is just a manifestation of what is finally a diseased brain? And indeed, I think there are very strong currents at the end of the 20th century moving the discourse more and more toward a medical model and further away from a social adjustment model, a cultural adjustment model, and the like. If indeed there is a bona fide mental illness, it really is a form of neuropathology, something in the transmitter system, something in frontal lobe function, something which diagnostic tools, as they get better and better, will quite reliably pick up. John Hinckley, for example, did show this edematous cerebral cortex. The sulci were somewhat swollen, and as his defense attorney, Mr. Fuller, pointed out on an occasion in which I was involved in a panel, this is reliably correlated with schizophrenia. Now, I think the jury was mightily impressed in the Hinckley case by this swelling that was picked up on brain scans. But of course that swelling could also be produced by a variety of infectious diseases, by, as I said jocularly at the time to Mr. Fuller, by mumps, for example. But the point is that society at large and the psychiatric community at large rest more easily when it can be shown that a particular form of, quote, mental illness, close quote, is closely tied in with some observable change in the physiological or biochemical aspects of the nervous system. Not only that, but the success of psychoactive agents, the success enjoyed within the domain of psychopharmacology in treating various forms of psychopathology further illustrates to the satisfaction of many that these disturbances are biochemical in the first instance. So it could very well be that the ultimate control of the labels will be back in medicine, but medicine now as medicine, not medicine as in psychiatry, clinical psychology, long experience, in-depth interviews. Did you have trouble with your father early in life, etc., etc., etc. And on this point, we might want to say that distinctions will be more sharply drawn between what might be called psychopathology and what might be called problems of adjustment. And when we get to the level of problems of adjustment, understand that that's a two-way street. To say that Smith is having trouble adjusting to the expectations of the community or society within which he lives may be saying much more about the community and society in which Smith lives than about Smith. And indeed, there may be some adjustments that we are never supposed to make, do you see? More on that later. On being sane in insane places, what is it that David Rosenhan did? I should tell you, I think this article, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, Professor Rosenhan said this on one occasion, I think this may be, if not the most cited experiment in psychology, then after Milgram and one or two others, it surely would be in the top 5 cited studies. Well, David Rosenhan has for a long time been a distinguished professor of psychology at Stanford University, and many years ago he talked himself and some of his students and colleagues into a quite interesting experiment that would have them getting admitted to a mental hospital. And in order to get admitted, they showed up at different times and were in no apparent way related to each other, but they had to come in with certain sort of vague presenting symptoms. They had to report certain psychological disturbances they were having, perhaps the occasional hallucinatory experience and nightmarish events and a kind of nervousness, a sense of a suspiciousness, a difficulty getting on with people, a restlessness and the like. They came in with this. Didn't quite know what was getting at them, but they needed some kind of admit. Now, the arrangement was this. Once admitted, they were to proceed to behave daily exactly as they would behave in life before the period of admission. So nothing they were doing, once admitted, in any way would alert or alarm a clinical staff, a medical or psychiatric community, to the possibility that these were people in need of any kind of psychiatric treatment at all. Their behavior became quite normal. Interestingly, the diagnosis on admission was entirely unresponsive to any behavior they displayed after admission. There was no change in the diagnosis, do you see? In other words, the diagnosis on admission turned out to be a kind of typology. These people now were this type, that is, a type requiring psychiatric treatment. Subsequent behavior was largely ignored or irrelevant. They would have lengthy interviews with members of the staff in which they responded correctly and entirely normally. One person in the group, who happened to be an authority on the subject of depression, noticed that another patient in the ward, who actually was a patient in the ward being treated for depression, was on a medical regimen, a pharmacologic regimen, that this expert on the subject of depression regarded as the wrong drug. It was not the drug of choice. And in fact undertook to have a quite lengthy discussion on this subject with one of the attending psychiatrists, who of course regarded the interlocutor as a patient, but nonetheless engaged the interlocutor in this long discussion. And chap pointing out that he had made a study of depression. He did think he knew quite a bit about it, and he thought that in this particular case the medicine prescribed wasn't right for that patient. So here's this long conversation going on. It might have been a conversation between colleagues. And what's written down on his chart once the conversation is over? What's written down is that he suffers grandiosity, do you see? So what he might have said for pay as a consultant, or as part of a convention address that this very psychiatrist might have been pleased and proud to attend, constituted grounds for having his own medication increased, do you see? Because after all, when somebody who's a patient says things like this, it can only mean one thing. He's quite grandiose. Well, what is it like being sane in insane places? What is it like being sane at all? What is it like being classified as a type, and namely as a type answering to the description psychopathology? Of course, what Rosenhan's study made quite clear is that once one is diagnosed as being an X, one is going to be treated as being an X, and it doesn't much matter how one behaves, what one says, what the contents are of one's perceptions and cognitions, what the affective tone of daily life is like, because the setting now has established that you are an X, and you will be an X forevermore. There was some great concern about whether these people were ever going to be able to get themselves released. That is to say, one was not going to get released merely on the grounds that one was no longer symptomatic, because in fact from the moment of their admission they ceased to be symptomatic. Indeed, had we been dealing with a scientifically developed mode of expertise, a scientifically developed mode of diagnosis, treatment, and the like, given the crowded nature of such facilities, the minute these people went into the second or third day of normal behavior, probably somebody would have sensed that there was a ruse going on. Why? The question that I always found very interesting and not answered by the research is, what is it members of the staff were missing here? Should it not have been starkly obvious going into this clinic that some number of people in the room were quite normal, just by way of a contrast effect? Now, of course, what David Rosenhan would be fully prepared to say and has said is that, well, of course, the reason why nobody noticed the stark contrast between the Stanford crowd and those who were there is that, in fact, there wasn't a stark contrast between the Stanford crowd and those that were there. And as has been observed repeatedly, both before this research and after, large fractions of clinical populations in mental hospitals only reveal themselves to be patients because of how they're dressed and how they're addressed and how they're treated or not treated. This is not to say there are not bona fide instances of serious disturbances at the level of cognitive life, cognitive and emotional life, warranting hospitalization and treatment. It is to say instead that for the longest time, the populations thus classified included only a relatively small, a worrisomely small percentage of people who manifestly, unequivocally, needed institutionalization and all of the treatments that go with conditions of so severe. Now, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the version of it that was available when I was a graduate student, listed homosexuality among the treatable disorders, among the psychiatric disorders requiring and warranting treatment. And DSM-4 doesn't have that listed. Now, let me make it clear to all within the range of my voice that I have neither the training nor the credentials, nor for that matter an opinion about homosexuality vis-a-vis psychopathology, psychiatry, clinical psychology, and the like. It is not a subject I've studied. It's not one that I'd be prepared to make a statement on, either amateurish or expert. I'm getting at a rather different point. The point I'm getting at is how those who have control of the labels decide whether or not to keep something labeled psychiatric disturbance warranting treatment. Well, actually, the way this got out of the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, and here if I seem to be sounding skeptical or cynical, I hope I can be forgiven for the moment. To some extent, the answer to the question, how did it get out of DSM, was by vote. That is to say, the American Psychiatric Association essentially polled on this question, decided that it should be removed, and so one asks on what basis that decision was made. Well, here the reasoning was rather truncated and on some accounts rather tortuous. It goes something like this. I hope I can recover the rationale here. It's not one that matches up well with the way I think about things, so I might get this a bit contorted. Stay with me. It goes something like this. Homosexuality has been notoriously refractory to psychiatric and psychological modes of therapy. That is to say, for generations, homosexuals entering a therapeutic venue for the purpose of being, quote, cured, close quote, have rarely enjoyed the kind of results that they sought. Well, if you assume that psychiatry and clinical psychology combined, along with pharmacology and all sorts of social supports and the power of law, if all this, operating over long periods of time at great cost to patients, in patience and in money and time and energy, has achieved but negligible results, well, then it mustn't be a disorder. That is to say, if it really were a bona fide disorder, our treatment modalities would be effective. Well, I guess there is something to that logic, but can you imagine the Board of Internal Medicine, or however the AMA organizes itself, specialists in board-certified internists in medicine having a convention and saying, look, there's a condition that we've referred to as incurable cancer. Every treatment modality that we've applied has failed. Obviously, if this really were a disease, our treatments would be effective. And since our treatments have gotten us absolutely nowhere in these cases, it mustn't be a disorder at all. Well, of course, I mean, the round of laughter would be sustained and audible even at a distance. Now, I say there is a tendency to be jocular at the expense of serious, hard-working people dealing with vexatious matters, and I don't want to be droll at their expense. There is something to the proposition that if a particular and complex pattern of human behavior, human sexuality itself, resists every imaginable therapeutic modality, perhaps it was never right to classify it as a disorder in the first instance. Well, all right, that then raises the question, how have disorders been classified in the first instance? And have you sworn off that, not just where homosexuality is concerned, but where the full panoply of so-called psychiatric or psychological involved? Now, I mentioned in an earlier lecture one instance of a homosexual in New Orleans being sent to the Tulane Medical Center and being, quote, cured, close quote, by direct stimulation of structures in the limbic system while the patient was watching heterosexual sexual films. This is do we want to call this a research program? The investigator here, the attending doctor, was very, very optimistic about the results. What you had was someone arraigned for a homosexual act, a homosexual proposition to a plainclothes officer in a public place. It resulted in his being brought before the judge. The patient defendant in question had a record of this conduct. This was in New Orleans, Louisiana, at a time when a repeat offender on this charge would see a period of imprisonment, fine and imprisonment, not a particularly long period of imprisonment. A judge, with all of the right liberal, decent reflexes, recognized, as he said at the time, that to send such a person to a prison would simply expose him to the sorts of assaults and the like that could only make the matter worse. But if the patient was willing to be sent to a psychiatric facility, nice doctors concerned about things, so be it. Well, of course, sensible chap that he was, he chose a hospital over a prison. Of course, the B part of the story, which apparently he wasn't clear on, was that almost nothing was going to go on in that psychiatric facility that was going to cure him of homosexuality. And so he was then told by the doctor who would do the brain stimulation work that, look, the statistics here are quite clear. If the only way you get out of this hospital is the medical staff saying that you're cured of your homosexuality, the odds are very much against you, and you could be here, essentially you could be here till planet Earth suffers the heat death. But we are doing these studies, and we've had some results, success with animal studies and the like. Would you like to try it? Answer is yes. A little burr hole is drilled with a dental drill. Electrodes are sunk. You find the place in the limbic system which, when electrically stimulated, gives rise to sexual excitement. Put a little paste there to keep that electrode in place. Smith now watches these essentially pornographic heterosexual films while stimulating this area of his brain, discovers now that there's conditioning forming between heightened sexuality and heterosexual sexuality graphically presented, says he'd like to try this for real. The ever-resourceful staff of this hospital then apparently searches high and low on the streets of New Orleans till they find someone who's willing to, shall we say, participate in the study, and we discover at the end of the day that the patient, quote, performed admirably, close quote, though that surely is not the adverb that I would assign to anybody associated with the entire project. Now, interestingly, as Michel Foucault points out in Madness and Civilization, this is just an instance of cultural standards determining that someone must be treated, and when those standards are finally matched up with the actual person, who now is declared to be a certain type, all bets are off. It's not a question of whether Smith is actually mad. It's a question of whether Smith has been labeled. And once Smith is labeled, the treatment ensues. The treatment is the treatment of a label, not a condition. If the same chap brought in before a judge in New Orleans years ago were brought in now, this whole scenario could not possibly have taken place. He wouldn't have been found in DSM. So, let the buyer beware.